thank you, Trond. Okay, again, apologies for my voice, but I'm going to try and moderate this panel and get a nice, robust discussion going. So what we're going to do is quickly introduce myself. I'm Lori from CSAIL, but I'm going to ask each one of the panelists just to say who they are, where they're from, and then I'm going to start opening questions to the panel, and hopefully then you also will have questions for the panel as well, as long as my voice holds out. So I'm Lori from CSAIL, and we're going to start with this gentleman right here.
My name is Eugene Kuznetsov. I'm the co-founder and chairman of Abine, which is an online privacy company for consumers. I was previously the founder of Data Power, which was a message-level security company that IBM acquired, and have also been involved with a number of other cybersecurity startups in the area. Veracode early on, Bit9, Resilient Systems, and some others.
Hi, Adam Towvim, co-founder and CEO of TrustLayers. We are commercializing my co-founder's prescient research out of MIT CSAIL around accountability systems. TrustLayers is really the world's first software platform that allows organizations to have greater confidence and greater scale in the use of big data, to be able to use personal data for revenue generating and marketing purposes at greater scale and still have that same confidence that all the data is being used properly, rules are being followed, regulations, and that policies are being adhered to. We focus primarily on healthcare and biotech and the financial services customers.
Frank Wang, I'm a third-year PhD student at MIT focusing on computer security. I do a lot of work with student entrepreneurship in the Boston area, specifically with Rough Draft Ventures. This summer, Gene and I are starting a Cybersecurity Factory. It's an initiative with Highland Capital, which is trying to turn PhD projects in security into something that's more commercializable. She can also talk a little bit more about the initiative.
Hi, I'm Jean Young. I'm a final year PhD student in CSAIL at MIT. My thesis is on a programming language for automatically enforcing security and privacy policies, so I'm interested in the technology from the programming languages angle. And I got interested in cybersecurity entrepreneurship because I was wondering how come more of these ideas don't make it into practice. And I just accepted a faculty position at CMU yesterday, so I'm really excited about that.
As a CMU grad, congratulations.
Hello, my name is Tina Srivastava, and I'm co-founder of Gigavation. We're a cybersecurity company founded by MIT and Harvard alumni, focused on securing the next generation of IT and Internet of Things. We have a little, almost $1 million in revenue, working with some key strategic partners, and we're looking for some more connections there. And my background is also from MIT Aerospace Engineering, and also from the System Design and Management program.
Good morning again. My name is Devon Watson. I lead software research and strategy for Diebold Corporation, which is a global fintech company. Despite what it says in your programs, I have nothing to do with the food industry. Despite consumption.
Danny Weitzner, nice to see you all.
George Wren, you've already introduced, thank you.
John Clevenger, likewise, Media Lab.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Okay, for some of the startups, you talked about trust and security. I'm going to kind of put out the first question to you. What are the most important trends in security, trust, and cybersecurity from a tech startup perspective?
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead. So one of the really important trends, I think, is that there's a merger between information technology and the Internet of Things. And what's going on is that a lot of devices, we've heard this term D2D or M2M, device to device or machine to machine, and a lot of these devices are infiltrating the traditional enterprise IT network. And a lot of the security solutions that we're focused on information technology that sit up at the app layer are increasingly inadequate at dealing with some of these low-level attacks and new systems. And as we see things like vehicle-to-vehicle, critical infrastructure and all these other systems leveraging and permeating the space, we see that the error rates, for example, that were acceptable in information technology enterprise world are no longer acceptable for really safety critical areas.
It's a really good way to think about the problem space. What we see, especially through work with our customers, is much greater scale of gathering all of that data. And traditionally, there was a focus just on securing it, or from a privacy and trust perspective, what you were doing at the time of collection. What is increasingly needed is a way of monitoring and validating that trust in downstream use, as it's passed to downstream systems from the endpoints into the enterprise. And also, we've all seen the four walls of the enterprise come crumbling down, either through hybrid cloud environments or certainly through internet-connected devices, sharing that data across these different boundaries of trust, and still being able to have that same level of confidence that you can use the data. So it's not just about catching a bad actor and securing against the downside risk. It's also, how do you move faster, and how do you generate more revenue or better meet the needs of your mission by still making use of that data at big data scale.
That's great, thank you. From the more established companies, do you have anything to add to this? Sorry?
I guess we're established. I think one of the trends that we're starting to see is that the data layer in the internet, sort of 4.0 or machine to machine or Internet of Things, whatever you want to call it, is really focused more on metadata rather than traditional content is king, has been true for the sort of the Facebook generation. So I think one of the areas where the technology does need to evolve, and it sounds like we've got some good expertise on this panel, is in the area of how do we secure that metadata to make sure that those commands that are going out to open bridges and close bridges, that layer 7 and up is secured, right? That's an area that we really need to focus in on. Whereas, we were looking before at content and how do we make sure we protect it. There was defacing of websites. The White House got hacked, right? It was defacement of the website. That was really a content-based. He didn't do it, but I had nothing to do with it either. That was a content-based attack, right? And I think what we're going to start seeing more is more of a metadata layer attack on these M2M systems.
Could I just, one trend I think is very interesting is the notion, it was the Bitcoin, the blockchain, and those set of protocols coming in the decentralized ledger. And some people take it to the point where they'll talk about trustless computing, that you actually don't have to trust any third party, any entity. And so it's signed, it scales, it's distributed. It's a new paradigm, it's a new way of looking at things. I think it cuts across virtually every component, and I think that is well worth paying attention to.
The one thing I'd say is, I think that there's actually an extraordinary amount of caution amongst those who have lots of data that has lots of value. And ironically enough, I think the caution increases the more socially important the data is. I think healthcare researchers are operating under an unfortunate degree of caution and concern because, again, especially with the scale of this data, because they don't know what's acceptable to do and what's not. And they're living with regulations and regulators who are well-intentioned, but have rules that are really very hard to apply at scale. So it's not popular to say in the privacy world always, but I think we actually could be doing a lot more with our personal data if we had better assurance structures.
Please.
Yeah, and something that we've been starting to see more in research, but also increasingly in industry, is openness to principled solutions. So in the beginning, people wanted to have the quick fixes, and they wanted to find what are the vulnerabilities or what are the fastest, easiest solutions we could have to get things to work. And in the last few years, especially, I've seen people be more open to principled solutions that have deeper foundations with mathematical guarantees that can help you make sense of all of the data and all of the policies that people have. And so as a programming languages person, I used to be very sad because nobody cared about this stuff. And also nobody cared about proving systems correct. Nobody cared about correct software or anything like that. And since Heartbleed, there are all these articles that come out and that say things like people verified the correctness of this Java implementation. They actually found one bug. And this was stuff nobody cared about before. But now any bug is a vulnerability, and so people are starting to care. And so you see a lot of these solutions that have very deep technical backings. So static analysis tools, tools that can help you prove the correctness of software, web frameworks that can give you end-to-end guarantees about the correctness of your solutions. These are starting to come out, and in research, they're definitely increasingly more popular, and we've started seeing companies with these kinds of ideas too. And so that's very exciting to me.
So I agree with that, and I think that's actually happening all across, that people understand that there are certain fundamental constraints, and if you live within those constraints, it doesn't matter what the vulnerability is, doesn't matter how much you trust the other party, you're not going to end up having your information lost. So for example, at Abine, we do these things which allow you to share things online and be on the web, but yet be protected. So unique email address, unique one-time credit card, unique one-time phone number, and therefore it doesn't matter what is the privacy policy of the website. It doesn't matter how they choose to use or misuse that data. It doesn't matter if they get breached. They never have your real email. They never have your real password. They never have your real phone number. They never have your real credit card. And it completely changes the equation. I think that's the interesting thing about that is not only do you see researchers and people in industry now get serious about programming languages and formal verification and principal systems, you actually see millions of consumers kind of figure it out and saying, wait a minute, my mom told me if I don't tell my secret to anyone, they can't misuse it against me later. And I think you see actually millions of people starting to take action and really protect themselves and take charge of it. And I think be it healthcare data or social networking data or financial data, we're going to see more and more of that where people are going to abstract their real identity from the things that they're doing in cyberspace.
Yeah, I think from the startup world, there's a couple of interesting trends. One trend is kind of we know we're going to get hacked. So kind of how do we respond to these hacks? How do we kind of how fast do we respond to these hacks? I think it's kind of known to people that data will be leaked, and kind of security is an insurance policy, but no one really kind of understands why or how much this insurance policy costs. A lot of the hacks that happen in Sony or all these healthcare places. A lot of these could be prevented if people just took the right security measures, but security is expensive and people don't really want to use it. So kind of there's this push toward easier to use security solutions. A lot of people use 1Password, LastPass because it's easy to use at the same time it's more secure. So kind of those solutions are taking off. And so also for people it's not that expensive and it's pretty easy to use. So that's very helpful to people, especially from the consumer enterprise side. It's we know we're going to be hacked. What is an easier way to have better security?
One of the things that we've seen we see all these trends from an enterprise spend point of view, right? And enterprise getting interested in investing more in security along these lines. But one of the things that I've seen some of the best financial technology players is doing is actually taking a very user-centric design element of security, right? Because as a consumer, I usually have a very poor understanding of security, right? I don't really care, because there's all these wonderful consumer protections. So if things get stolen, worst case scenario, Amex is going to overnight me a new card and I'm back in business, and maybe I have to pay for something on a MasterCard, God forbid, right? But if you provide an incentive and a benefit use case to the consumer that also drags the security along, you're much better off, right? So we've seen a lot of banks start to really think that through. The simple examples in the U.S., right? We hardly use, with the exception of an iPhone, biometrics, right? And we're one of those populations where the metric system is a perfect example. You're going to go metric, and the U.S. population said, nah, no, we're not, right? You have to provide a net value to consumer, or they won't use it, even if it's for their own good.
Yeah, I think the user experience is very important. It's a great point about consumers and just being able to do a quick facial recognition. USAA now does that with my banking app. So that's great for the consumer. We also see that, especially in our work, because our direct customer ends up, and direct end user ends up being the enterprise. And the enterprise today, trying to instrument that kind of trust and connecting policies and data, it's just a mess. It's a real mess. Assembling all the policies and the documents, keeping track of things in Word, coming up with all these Excel sheets to track everything, and then somehow being able to go in and audit that data. If you can bring everything together into one very clean user experience, then all of a sudden the organization operates just the way the sales organization uses Salesforce in a unified UI. You can really bring together a great user experience, and you accelerate that implementation of trust, and then people use the data more and have greater confidence in its use.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I'm also an organizer of the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium, and we hear a lot of pain points from CIOs and CISOs and their elevated role in the organization. And one of the biggest problems is that the enterprise is being infiltrated with all of these different device connections and sensors and new systems that are really not tracked or covered by the existing security software. And so we see a lot of cases where enterprise critical data is now being used on devices that have no protection. And a lot of these devices don't necessarily even have an operating system that's the same. It's an RTOS instead, or some kind of other embedded device. And a lot of these systems are becoming vulnerability points in a very large way and keeping a lot of folks up at night.
Good points. Sorry. Those are some awesome points that were made by our panelists. Does anyone have any questions from the audience about some of these points that were made? Yes.
I actually have a question for John, but
oh, sorry. Excuse me 1 second while Tron gets you a mic.
Rod Walton, Qualcomm. Questions for John, and he mentioned the blockchain as being somewhat disruptive technology in addressing some of the security threats, and I'd like to hear John say a few words more about what the specific attributes of the blockchain are and how they address these security threats differently than some of the more traditional methods that we've been hearing about.
Well, I think what's extraordinary about it, I mean, so people think of the Bitcoin and the blockchain as two different things. They're related. But the blockchain itself is a decentralized ledger, and the fact that you do not have to depend upon any third party and that to verify and sign for a transaction. And so I think the whole principle is there that you don't trust a human agent. So there's also, you can put contracts. There's a group called Ethereum. And Ethereum is a different protocol than the Bitcoin protocol. It's not a proof of work, it's a proof of stake, or they just came out with a recent release. They have a programming languages, like 3 of them that they're bringing out. I'd be interested in comment on that. And they even have their own browser. But the idea is that you can have smart contracts, and you can write the contracts, and the contracts will execute a set of rules, and they'll sign for it and put it on a ledger. And that's a public ledger that everyone can see. I think that's a sort of a radical solution to this, but scales very fast. I mean, the fact that it's totally decentralized, no one person controls it. I think it's in a first phase. It's like a Napster version of things. That is it really clear that it's going to be proof of work? Is it really the Bitcoin going to be the protocol? But I think there's a whole architecture, a whole set of principles there it's going to change many people's thinking, and it's hit the financial community where. And from the security point of view, the areas that we're looking at, KYC and AML, that becomes very critical. And so the extent to which that is going to create a new set of conventions and how you can verify identities against a set of digital credentials that are derived in a mobile network.
Thank you, John. Danny.
It's Bitcoin and blockchain is flavor of the month. I think it's oversold. On this front. There's no question it's brilliant technology. It's a brilliant solution to a certain class of security problems. If your problem is creating and securing a distributed, decentralized log, blockchain is for you. What I would suggest from the enterprises that we see and from looking at governments is that the challenge is not having a log or even trusting a log. The challenge is, how do you analyze the log? How do you look at the transactions that are actually reflected there to decide whether A, you've got the right transactions logged, and B, what they mean. Do they have properties of accountability or not? So I think it's a really interesting substrate for accountability, but it is not self-executing accountability even a little bit. We have oodles and oodles of logs. Every once in a while I try to figure out how much log data we might be producing, and it's very large. This is to George's point about metadata. We've got so much of it. What we see, though, is that enterprises have no idea what to do with it, and simply having it verified and decentralized isn't going to help anyone figure out what to do about it.
I disagree.
Well, but what does it get you?
I think there are a lot. Well, no. Well, there are a lot of enterprises are looking at this in a very different way. From banks to a whole set of companies in a distributed model, and actually outsourcing and giving people control over their own data. So it's a decentralized, non-enterprise model where the people have control over their data. It doesn't come through the enterprise directly. I mean, there's a longer conversation. But I think the idea is, yes, you can put it on a log, but you can verify various attributes of the log, and you can run a set of rule sets, and you can enforce a basic set of regulations, so those regulations are applied to those set of data attributes and sign for that, and it goes in a public ledger.
Right, and all that requires is to make sure you're logging the things that you care about and that you have enough semantics around the policy and around the transactions. I think it's a great way of collecting logs. It provides no, you still have to know what you're analyzing. You still have to know what questions you're asking of the log. Bitcoin's great because it has a very simple question, which is, is the value being transferred according to a set of rules? When you get to information rules, when you get to more complex privacy and other policy rules, you have a different set of questions.
Well, I just have to say that's not true.
This is great. This is fantastic discussion.
So we have a contest here.
This is great.
There's no ontology. There's no shared ontology and semantic, right? So because of that, I hate to say you're both right, but yeah, to some level.
That's right.
Well,
okay,
I mean,
and this is great. The difference of opinion is fabulous.
It's API calls, tokens, and being able to have rule sets to control the tokens. I mean, this is it's pretty.
This is great.
We're going down to the weeds.
Yes, I was thinking the panelists also weigh in.
I would say that the one thing about a lot of the recent breaches that we've all seen in the sort of mass media is that in most of those cases, those Fortune 500 companies had the breach in their log for weeks before they figured out they had been breached and millions of credit cards and medical records had left their network. So I think the idea that them having a cryptographically secure log, then they will then take months to analyze that that's going to fix the problem, I'm pretty skeptical about that. I think for currency, for contracts, clearly great applications of a blockchain, some really interesting IoT applications, but I think the notion of this really large distributed log that somebody's going to analyze, there's nobody more motivated than Target or Anthem Health to analyze security log data, and they failed.
And if one establishes a set of policies and you can semantically model that and instrument it and connect it in real time to the data, you start to develop a set of authorized use. You start to develop some boundaries of what authorized use looks like and less of a crutch on some of this anomaly detection, which someone's always going to figure out how to stay below tripping the wire anyhow. And you end up trusting the data more and able to use it at greater scale.
I have to agree with John on this one because I think so I think everyone's talking about kind of analyzing these logs, but let's be honest here. If I'm a hacker, I've seen a few red teams. You go in, first thing you do is delete these logs. There's no trust chain. So we need I think what the point he's trying to make is we don't have one central point of trust. So for example, a certificate authority we have right now, it gets hacked, you're screwed, right? Because now you're a browser, you have to go and start revoking, and then you don't know what's trusted, what's not trusted. So the Bitcoin kind of decentralized trust is we're having, if you agree that 50% of all certificate authorities are honest, for example, then we can trust this certificate or this public key. I think it's first having that first layer saying can we trust these logs? Are these logs trustworthy? Who's signing them? And this decentralized world where it's saying we can agree that if I'm a hacker, I won't hack 50% of servers. That's pretty strong. It's decentralizing this trust and one person saying are these logs trusted or not? If we don't have trustworthy logs, we can't do any analysis anywhere. So I think that's the point that John's trying to make, and I
just think
agree with that.
It's necessary but not sufficient as well. I agree. There's lots of value you can get, but it doesn't magically produce.
Sure.
Layers of power.
Yeah.
But I feel if you don't have that, it doesn't really matter how
well,
much
I don't actually agree. I don't actually agree with that. This is to the previous point. I don't. As I look at real privacy violations out in the world, and I'm distinguishing privacy violations from security violations. Most privacy violations happen because people who are authorized to access data do the wrong thing with it. So that's where you need not just the kind of trustworthiness of the log entries, but as Eugene said, you need to be able to analyze what's actually reflected in the logs. And again, that's why I'd say it's necessary, because you want to know that the logs are reliable, but not sufficient. I have not seen many cases in which there's some major privacy breach that happened, and people said, oh, we would have caught it, but someone faked the logs. That almost, I don't know of a single major privacy problem in which that happens. Obviously, that can happen in a security breach, but I just think they're different threat models.
So building on that, where you say it's necessary but not enough, and we talked about Anthem and Target, what are some of the cybersecurity, corporate concerns? Really, what are the main things that corporations are concerned about right now in cybersecurity? We talked about some great ones.
So I would say one of the big issues is what was pointed out earlier is sort of the permeability now of the enterprise network. It's no longer, we used to all live in the castle thinking that we were safe, right? Because we had these these moats and we had these doors and everything was going to be But the reality is now is that it's it's just the Wild West now in a lot of corporate networks for a variety of reasons. The firewall technology hasn't caught up to the sophistication of attack, for example. So there's a lot of ways into networks now, and the users themselves introduce a lot of, it's still shocking to me that, you hear these statistics about the uptake of CD-ROMs. If you throw a CD-ROM into a parking lot, a corporate parking lot, there's like a 99.95 chance that an employee, if you write with magic marker payroll data and you throw it into the parking lot, it's like a 99.95% probability that an employee will take that on the way into work and stick it in the drive and then auto-run the thing, right? And with USB sticks, it's like 60% or 50 or 60%. It's pretty high, right? So as a hacker who's a statistician, gee, if I have 5 USB sticks and a CD-ROM with information in a hostile executable, it's almost child's play for these threat actors to take over corporate networks now. And they attack the human. So the human is another weak point in the chain. So I think those two are the big factors.
Does anyone else have anything to add on to that?
Well, I agree with that completely. And just to build on that, I think it's also important to consider why USB sticks and those types of devices are still being used, because one thing is to say that, oh, well, we should just stop using them, but why are they so ubiquitous? Why are they everywhere? Well, and a lot of it is what we've been talking about on this IT-OT merger that you're talking about, this operational environment. We have a lot of networks and systems that used to be air-gapped, that they weren't network connected, and now they're starting to come to this connection. And we get to a lot of things with automotive and IoT, where we see a security paradigm where the way that safety was really ensured was to have critical networks like your CAN bus physically disconnected from your infotainment and all your other systems. But now you reach a point where you have a killer app. You have vehicle-to-vehicle networks that have been proven by test demonstrations with the 5 top automakers that demonstrate the incredible increase to passenger safety. A major killer of Americans could be eliminated or significantly reduced, but we can't get to that level because of these threats, because of these connections, because of these secure networks now being connected, and just like you said, that permeability of that network and all these devices coming in, it's really a challenge.
Great. Yes.
This is maybe a different kind of question, but can you kind of characterize the dialogue between marketing, sales, kind of product development, and the cybersecurity teams, and what's that tension of getting product out versus, hey, we need to kind of have a secure infrastructure?
Tense. Very, very tense.
And I think, when you think about what a revenue generating side of the house, we sometimes think of it as the offense side, and then security and privacy, legal, compliance. You've got this defensive side of the house that's trying to control and lock down all of the data. What you really need to be able to do is let the business line owners, the marketing and revenue generating side, understand where those guardrails are and be able to just move a little faster. So just because you've got a lot of very sensitive health data in-house doesn't mean you can't ever use it. Well, in the right environment, set against the right policies, you can actually drop it in to a lot of marketing campaigns, and you can use it to inform and have greater relevance to your audience and your customer, and enable that. But there has to be some type of instrumentation of those guardrails, and there's some layer where people can have a communication between offense and defense. And, programming languages and the representation of those policies is key.
So I'd like to answer your question, because we're on the front lines of this every day in our role. So in some cases, we've met the enemy and it's us, right? Our own development and our own people who are working on product development either don't understand or they do understand and they are not incentivized to carry out security testing or code review and so on. So one of the things that we've done at Schneider is we've implemented a very large-scale security development lifecycle where we have stage gates that products go through and offerings go through. And we've had to, the conversation in some cases, not all, but in the more difficult cases I think are relevant to your question are, they come to us and say, what do you think about releasing this product or this offering? It could be a cloud-based offering. And my response is, I think you should delay it by 30 days. Yeah. And they say, well, why? And I say, well, according to our dashboard, and you haven't done pen testing. You haven't documented the security features and how to operate them within your offering. So I ask Fred on my team is the SDL manager, director. He goes in and puts bright red on those ones that they haven't done. These are gaps. And we say you can't release until you do that. And then we put a long explanation of why it's a very bad idea to go forward. Then they look at that and say, you know what? Okay, you're right. We won't go forward. Let's get the pen test. Let's get all these other things organized and documentation out. And then we'll look at it again and say, okay, we think it's probably safe now, right? And so there is a bartering that goes back and forth, right? But it has to be based upon data, has to be based upon fact, has to be provable, right? You have to have a system of reference to look at and say, and you have to have a standard. What's the standard to release this stuff? And are you meeting it or not?
The thought pattern that I've started to see emerge, which I really like, is kind of changing the model between prod dev and InfoSec, right? Because typically it does go through kind of a stage gate process, but for a product that's really kind of pushing some boundaries, especially in the payment space, right? We're seeing that all the time. The traditional model starts to break, right? Because if we look at, here's how we secured historically, but the world just changed in how we're transacting, right? We have to then partner up and say, all right, InfoSec, you have to innovate here to make this secure because it isn't going to fit into the historical paradigm. And if I do the usual things, it'll fail. And we can both agree on that before we get started, right? So how do we innovate on security, actually spend some money there, spend some capital, use it as a differentiator instead of, historically having a 4-month arm wrestle that ends in no, we can't release. And then we all sit there and watch the news where somebody, probably right over there, came up with the same thing, right? Said the heck with the existing rules, released, and made a bunch of money, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing in that conversation, I spent a little over 5 years in the defense industry, and one of the challenges that a lot of players face is that it's often not just a 30-day delay to address those problems. Once you go into pen testing, you get a whole set of problems that are oftentimes really unsolvable. You find fundamental threats in your security architecture and your system, and you really face a challenge of you don't have a solution to address those, but now you've made them aware, so now you're kind of in a liability situation of I can't address this because now I know of this problem, and like you said, that other folks maybe just don't look at the problem, so then they kind of can go under a mask and can just release it without knowing the problem. That's part of the reason why I'm here today at Gigavation, because we decided that it's important to actually solve this problem, and there's a big difference between the pen testing solutions that reveal vulnerabilities and those solutions that actually are kind of breakthrough and solving them and offering an approach forward, which I think is what's really missing.
One thing I think you have to look at also is that there's the the more straightforward case of a product rollout lifecycle where you insert the appropriate questions at the appropriate point and then you roll it out and then you move on. Then there's this challenge in a more dynamic context where you have operational system services. In your world, food service right now, financial services. The challenges there, I think, is that these are dynamic systems with dynamically evolving threats. So you have to have a more formal model. You have to have more ongoing visibility into threats, and it's going to have to be just a much more of a feedback process. I think that the security world is ahead of this from the privacy world, as Adam suggested. There is at least a methodology, if only manual, where you know what to put on the dashboard, right? And I think in the privacy world, where the kind of services that we're talking about are really just unusual combinations of different data sources that come together into different services, there's no like physical product there that you can go test against. It's a much less tangible thing and requires, I think, a much more dynamic approach.
That's great. So we've heard a lot from some of the corporate concerns. Sorry again for my voice. But from the startup side, so there's a lot of challenges out there that need to be met. From your side, what does the ecosystem look like? What are the challenges to it? How can the ecosystem be improved to address this? Eugene, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think on the privacy side, which is where Abine is concerned, one of the challenges in the mindshare several years ago is a lot of people thought that privacy is dead. Mark Zuckerberg told us that nobody cares, it's a social norm, and what we found out is that actually people do care once they find out what's going on. And I think the same is true for security as well, the broader category, that a lot of the time, large companies or industry analysts or even academia say, look, this doesn't really matter, sort of get over it. And that what happens is that years later we find out that, this is actually really dangerous and people do really care, and you can start companies in that space and you can help solve the problem. I think it's probably one of the biggest things, the initial skepticism in any given area, and I think we see that every time a new set of threats comes around.
One reason that we started Cybersecurity Factory was we found that there are a lot of challenges that startups face when they try to get started in this area. So one is that a lot of the infrastructure to help startups get started is for consumer-facing startups. And a lot of these security ideas are enterprise-facing. And so they're just not as sexy. There's nowhere else to put it. They can't compete with the Tinder for dogs or the Uber for laundry when they're pitching, and they don't have the same kind of demo, and they just can't be evaluated in the same way. And there are other problems. For instance, so a lot of these enterprise companies, they need to find clients. And if you're a startup, and especially if you're coming from academia, you just don't have these connections, and it's very hard to make these kinds of connections. And also, a final problem is there's just not a good knowledge of how to talk to clients about why they should trust you or why you can provide them with a solution, because the clients don't know how to evaluate these solutions. There's not really a general understanding of this is how we approach them and explain these solutions. And so these are all things that we think we should work together as a community on.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's really hard to get some of those initial pilots in place. We were very fortunate, given our background, some of the early research and a roadmap that was already there, and we were able to drop it in to certain situations. But I look and I see a lot of my peers in the startup community sort of caught in that chicken and egg kind of situation. And a lot of the technology is extremely well thought out, but being able to go to those first set of customers, and then how do you then go into, you really need to be going into some of the Fortune 100. They have the most sophisticated needs, but how do you balance that with the fact that you're early on? So we're trying to help people get as far along as as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Actually, building off the last 2 points, I think also Gigavation has been fortunate in having some key initial customers that are really able to provide us test beds and able to get us in there. So we've done operational testing, but I think that is a big concern. And one of the biggest challenges in finding the right clients in the enterprise space is identifying those those companies that really want to solve the problem, that really care about the threat and want to solve it, versus those that just want to be able to demonstrate, okay, we got the the name brand solution in place, the traditional stuff, and so we can call it good enough.
Great. Are any thoughts from the audience on how to impact this? Yes.
The question regarding firewalls, because when I research, I find firewalls is a medieval concept since the 1200s, and as George said, yeah, really. And it was shocking that, I'm not into cybersecurity, and the amount of customers that they liked our dynamic information solution. And my question is there any other thing beside firewall that's stopping people from getting in? Because with the data breaches, it's been a bloodbath. I mean, last year. So why aren't people doing anything?
I could try to answer your question about that. So one of the things later on in the presentation, because we had a short window we didn't get the chance to go into, is this concept of defense. It actually gets back to the medieval concept of the castle, unfortunately, but this concept of defense in depth and breadth, right? So not just the firewall, but having the scalder, who's going to dump the hot oil on who's ever trying to kick the gate down. Whoever's trying to kick the firewall down, is going to be scalded or shot full of arrows, right? So yes, you need really to design a multi-layered security. One of the things that you're taught very early on, if you're ever designing security architecture, is that, at least for me, and this is what I've been taught, is to always assume that the first two levels of protection will actually fail, right? And that you'll need to rely upon, tertiary and beyond security levels, right? So the problem is not that the firewalls can be bypassed. They screen out a lot of bad traffic, okay? But they don't screen out all of it, okay? So it really gets to the point that a lot of companies, psychology, it's a really industrial psychology. They think, the CEO thinks, I've got a firewall, we're secure, right? Well, not really, right? And so they sort of bury their head in the sand oftentimes when it comes to security. And if we have a firewall and it's configured properly and the auditors come in and tell us that, then we're probably okay, right? And really, it requires a much more depth and breadth approach in terms of securing your assets and your people, like I showed that one slide. Right now, we're seeing a disturbing trend as the security technology catches up. The human now is a target of attack, right? Whether it's the CD-ROMs or the USB sticks or phone calls. Hi, I'm calling from tech support. I heard you lost your password. Can we reset it for you? I got a call from a guy saying, it was the IRS before the breach notification, saying that they were calling me because they wanted to verify my information. I was like, okay, the IRS doesn't call to verify information, so this is a scam, bye, and I hung up. So, you really need to have a multidisciplinary program for security beyond a firewall.
The risk of being out there even further. I go back and forth between the East Coast and West Coast and San Francisco. So there's a really interesting, and when you think about startups, and the conversation here has been very enterprise-centric. And I think what we're seeing now is that there's a blending that, you say, are you enterprise or consumer-facing? I think there's a blending, and I think those boundaries are getting changed. And I think so. If you feel that, and I've done 6, 7 startups myself, and I know that it's very difficult to make an enterprise sale. My God, and the decision cycle is completely counter to what an enterprise needs. So it's very costly. But now, what you have the ability. I mean, I was at Harvard for 10 years when Facebook was there. I was one of the first people on Facebook, and you see something like that take off, and you have the ability to sort of launch things and test them, and that you can do your living labs and get adoption without having to have the permission of an enterprise. And I do think that some of the successful companies have done that and scaled up on that. It's a different mentality, it's a different way you fund a company, and it's a different mindset. And I think that needs to be recognized, because the whole dichotomy between the enterprise and the individual, I think, is breaking down. And so I would encourage that when you're doing startups, I mean, if you can get out there and build something and people respond to it and learn from your customer base, do the whole agile computing thing, then I think it's a much better way of thinking about it than more your traditional say, okay, or easier than having to do pure enterprise.
Can I just agree with John, for
You're
1 minute?
agreeing. That's great.
Because I actually think that the good news is that there are even some enterprises who are feeling that enterprises are out of date. And I think enterprises, in some part, have become so big and kind of overwhelmed with themselves that they need sources of innovation. And I think one of the real advantages that startups have is that we are sources of innovation. We have to succeed where most people in enterprises don't have to succeed, and for better, right? Right. And I think the key is partly to find those people in enterprises who want to behave in this agile way. Because I agree 100%. You can't iterate your product market fit at the pace of an enterprise RFP cycle.
That's great. Eugene, do you have something to add?
Yeah, Abine is a consumer company very much, right? So we have millions of users that download our software and use our services. Most of the other security companies I've been involved with were enterprise companies. And I would disagree there. I think the nature of the problem controls the kind of business that you build and how you fund it. If step one is you have to build a security ASIC, that's going to take a certain number of millions of dollars before you're finished and you can show anything to a customer. And that's okay. There's a lot of biotech companies around here, and I don't think any of them expect to have funding and innovation at a pace of a Facebook, which is a PHP website. I mean, great business success, but we're not going to find the cure for cancer at the same kind of pace. And we just got to be comfortable with it and understand that we need to have investors and management teams that are capable of doing things that are more complicated, because otherwise all we'll have is more PHP websites.
Okay, I think we've got a couple of questions. Steve,
Can I focus back on this enterprise question? So I woken up one morning and suddenly, justifiably, I'm chief executive of a manufacturing company with plants in 100 countries. And then I can't trust my code. I can't trust my people. I've got Eugene deploying consumer stuff in my organization. I've got threats in the organization that might set light to my infrastructure. What do I tell my non-execs? What do I tell my auditor? How do I look down on a multi-billion-pound business and go, 1 in 5 of my peers is being torn down once a year? Where do we start with that discussion? So startups, that's a hard discussion for a startup to have with the chief exec and say, I'm going to solve your problem. Well, we don't even know where to start with that.
George?
Yeah, I'll stop with the security talk and put the management hat on for a minute. So I think the answer really from an innovation standpoint is that the internet is not it is a new paradigm, but it's not a new paradigm that corporations face, end forces. If you look at Porter and the classical, theorists before, dare I say up the river here at the business school, the other business school, there's been, whether it's Christensen or Ian Sadi or any of these guys, or even Kim Clark, former dean of the business school, there's been a series of these challenges that corporations have had, through the industrial age, So it's not a new idea that the world is a changing place, right? And that my competitors are changing. It's just a matter, I think what it is it's really overwhelming, and it's happening now at the speed of light, right? Whereas before, it might have maybe at a more measured pace, right, with other innovations. So there's always been technical disruption out there. But this is sort of the mother of all technology disruption, what we're seeing right now. So the conversation with the CEO is, well, if we look back for IBM, we look back on our 100-year history, we see that, okay, here's what the mainframe brought in for us, here's what distributed computing did to us, here's how we adapted to distributed computing, okay, and here's what we did in that paradigm. So, and if you look at the folks who didn't change, with Microsoft, for example, in the mobility, not getting onto that bus, not getting onto the internet bus with the browser and Netscape, these are just a series of technical challenges and pressures that companies have failed to respond to. So this is just another one in a long line of pressures that are either well responded to or companies fail to respond to.
Danny?
One of the things, Steve, I think you would do is you would decide you have to look at your world through the lens of risk and resilience, not through the lens of design perfection. So as much as I'm a total exponent of the provably correct systems behavior, we shouldn't expect that we're going to be able to prove to you that everything's fine, because everything is not going to be fine. The question is, how bad is it? And have you identified the places where you have the highest risk on an ongoing basis? And can you do something about them? I think the kinds of systems and visibility that Gene and others are talking about help you get there, because it's more because they help with visibility and they help with risk management. They don't guarantee you anything, but they do make you more confident that you're not going to miss things. And I think, as you know, this is the way mature, I hate to use the word enterprise, but I will. It's the way mature institutions function, and it's the way people function too. We're not each individually perfectly healthy in our physical bodies, but we try to, make sure that we're, reasonably pulled together and check the things that need to be checked. And I think that's the way you'd think about the world. And the final thing I'll say is that that's a big barrier to get over, because I think there has been a sort of a black boxness about technical systems where we assume they either work or don't work on a kind of a binary basis, and that someone will just tell you, and if it doesn't work, you'll buy another one or whatever it is. And I think, obviously, we need a more sophisticated view than that.
Thank you, Danny. I know we had another question somewhere. There you go, sir.
Thank you. Just a simple, I think is a simple question. At MIT, I've seen people work on designing for failure instead of against failure. How is that paradigm of designing a system expecting to be hacked and being resilient, how does that affect how you build out the IT security infrastructure? Because if a system is simple enough that if it fails, it's okay, you can recover quickly, do you need a lot of big cybersecurity force?
Gene, you're nodding your head. Gene, do you want to start?
So there has been research on designing for failure, and a lot of this is this does require a big cybersecurity force in some ways, because it involves, first of all, detecting that the failure occurred, collecting enough information that you can roll back your system to a point that you can recover from the failure, and doing various things that are the right thing to do to recover for that failure. And often these solutions are deeply technical. You need a good, reliable way to detect failure. You don't want just the system thinking that it's failing all the time, because that's very expensive. And you want to collect enough data that you can detect the failure, but you don't want to collect all the data, because then your system can't go anywhere. And so there's a lot of things people can do, but it requires being smart about how you're collecting the data, detecting the failure, and recovering.
So I love the positive notion that any question could be simple for this panel. That's a very positive outlook. Coming back to user-centric design for 1 second, when we look at failure scenarios, you can look at it as multi-layered security, right? And that's fine, and you should build it in such a way that you don't necessarily presuppose the attack vector or order at which those things are breached, right? But there's a risk mitigation trade-off to be made between how secure do you want to make that, and how much does that eventually start to potentially impact either your agility or the consumer's experience, right? Because as consumers, with that threat detection concept, I'm actually going to be really, really upset if I go to do something and you as an institution or service provider say, no, you're not Devon Watson, because I'm pretty damn sure I am. My mom told me so, right? And that's a really unsatisfying, not okay scenario, right? So preventing a false negative is almost as important as preventing false positives.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Devon and some of the other comments as well. And one of the other designing for failure scenarios that actually Steve brought up is this insider threat. So this is a growing concern. A lot of enterprises don't like to talk about it openly, and it's really that designing for the fact that your trusted employees inside your organization, your IT administrators, are going to act against the organization, and that's a big challenge and a big problem. I mean, Edward Snowden was an IT administrator with access. That's why he could take the USB hard drive out of that space and go to Russia. And there's a lot of a big concern there, and that's another aspect of the design process that really has to be fundamental in the security architecture and the security design.
Yeah, I think also the idea of designing for failure is like fairly complicated because when things fail, most of the time people don't know why they fail. So like people can attack you from all sorts of places, right? And so most of the time when you're a failure, a lot of companies, even like big companies like Google and Facebook, they kind of spend a lot of time figuring out what happened, like what parts are vulnerable, what exactly like was breached, like what data leaked, and kind of like there's a lot involved with kind of like rolling your system back and playing it forward in like a way so that like the attacker might still be in the system, they might be out. Like there's a lot of questions when you realize something has happened, even in failure, because like you don't know, there's so many attack vectors. And so at the end of the day, like there's a lot of like time, human time, like technical time spent figuring out like what exactly went wrong, like what can we fix, or like how do we get our systems back into like a reasonable state.
Great, thank you. We've talked a lot about different innovations and things. Where's the smart money bet? Like what's the thing to bet on? Anybody want to take that? Yes.
I would bet that systems are going to continue to be released with major security holes in them, and that and any type of company that focuses on the new compute paradigms of mobility and the Internet of Things and is focused on securing everything from the human being to the processes that are being controlled in an autonomous fashion would probably be pretty successful.
Okay.
You know what's amazing about all this is you would think that companies might somehow react by gathering less data because they're concerned about it. But the reality is we've got this whole cybersecurity meme going on along with a big data evolution. And you can't react to this by saying you're going to slow down on any of the data that you're collecting and using as an enterprise. So one thing that's guaranteed to happen is you still need to stay ahead. Just because there's the concern about a God view tool running amok and everybody's privacy being violated, or data leaking out of an anthem, or data being misused, as Danny was talking about before, for privacy violations, you still need to get ahead. And if you don't, someone like a Lyft and a sidecar is going to come along and just beat you to the punch. So you still need to be collecting more data, and you still need to be maximizing the innovation and use of that data. You just need some mechanism of confidence to know that it's all being used properly.
I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is really sort of policy, right? When you look at what the government is likely to do if we have a really dangerous breach with loss of life against any of the critical infrastructure, you could imagine a level of response that will be radically disruptive to the entire IT infrastructure. And we've had a few cases in various countries, certainly in the United States. We know what happens, that all of a sudden, all of the slow policy-making processes and sort of completely senseless congressional bills suddenly get rewritten, passed in a week, and you're now living in a completely different environment. And I think that, unfortunately, that's quite likely because anybody who's involved in IoT and some of the more critical infrastructure knows that we have major vulnerabilities. It appears that we're not able to address them without having a really horrifying example where these vulnerabilities become apparent to the citizenry. And I think once that happens, you're going to have very rapid change. And it's unfortunate we can't get ahead of it because I think anybody who knows anything about it realizes that we're very vulnerable.
Actually, just to quickly build on that, I see the FTC is doing a great job of trying to get ahead of that. They're incredibly focused around downstream use of all of this data that's being gathered about us.
And this is great. Thank you all so much. This conversation is fabulous. We could have definitely gone on for another hour. But Ron just told me he needs the last 2 minutes. I want to thank you all, panelists. Thank you so much.
So as we're wrapping up, I'm going to ask the panel to sit tight, please, because otherwise we won't get through this. And I'm sure people will want to come up and see you, probably in that order. I'm going to give 1 minute to Tavish over here to speak about, because as I said, this is not just a workshop. We have lots of follow-ups. One of the things you can do is take a course in cybersecurity. Tell us about it.
Hi, Tavish Baker, Marketing Manager over at MIT Professional Education. And just taking a moment here to let you know, we have some flyers up on the table for a course that's coming out in September 15th on cybersecurity. 14 instructors from CSAIL will be teaching this, and Lori Glover is heading this development of this over at CSAIL. It's an online course, 6 weeks, self-paced. Great opportunity for you, your colleagues, your networks to, and I'm just quoting here, explore fundamental technologies and applications in cybersecurity. One of the instructors is Daniel Weitzner himself on a landscape of cyber policy. So flyer says a lot more and says it better. Please pick it up on your way out, and thank you.
All right, great. The last thing I wanted to say is, I think I introduced this early on. Here we see ourselves a little bit at the Startup Exchange as a kind of an executive dating agency. So now is the time that I want you to share. So let's start with a show of hands, which is easier. Have you met someone here today? Okay. Have you met someone special here today? Does anyone care to elaborate? And you feel free to volunteer. We're going to do a little interview with someone who's met someone special. Thank you.
I'll say it. I mean, I've met a couple of entrepreneurs here already, actually before the event and during the event, that I'm looking forward in talking about what they're doing and understanding where they're going and how they fit into the overall landscape that we have. So yeah, absolutely. I've met two.
That's what we like to hear.
Met a potential partner here, made the assumption they were much deeper down in the hardware stack, and it turns out a great vision for where things are going at higher level content across these distributed devices. So it's sort of a great partnership opportunity to explore.
All right, well, I'm not going to challenge you further, but please take the last few minutes. We're not going to kick you out here, so if you still want to meet someone special, take some more minutes. We have some people sitting here. I want to thank everyone who was involved. I don't think you quite can imagine how much work it is to put on something like this. Even though this is not an event with 500 people, I can assure you we've worked very hard, and many of those people are around me. I would just want to thank Casey here, for instance, fantastic worker at ILP. Margaret, who's on vacation, but I think she's in Vegas, God bless her, but basically has worked tirelessly for this event. We have Eric sitting here tweeting, and many, many others that have contributed. Mike Lawson here was helping with the slides. There's so many people to thank. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of the day. Come back for automation and Internet of Things in manufacturing in June, or join us in the fall for digital healthcare, personalized healthcare, nanotech, or many, many other things. Or come back to us, join our program, exploit this opportunity. It's a very, very focused way to meet people that I think matters to you. And thanks so much for your attention.